Awesome, thank you. All right, so based on what you guys said, I'm glad that you guys are kind of looking more towards the technical side of things because that's where I live, especially with design systems and technical side. But just to introduce myself a little bit, I'm Burton Smith. My email is burton@breakstuff.io. Feel free to email me. I try to be responsive to that. And as well on Twitter, I'm on there pretty regularly at StuffBreaker, or on LinkedIn if you want to connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm also on there pretty regularly. So feel free to reach out. I love talking to people, especially about technology stuff. I love technology, so feel free to reach out with any questions or ideas that you may have. Just a little bit about me. Just some personal stuff a little bit. I love jamming on the ukulele and the guitar. And yes, I put a picture of Ryan Gosling up there playing the ukulele so that you know that it is both manly and sexy to play the ukulele. So just a quick reminder in case there was ever a question about that. And another thing is I really love martial arts. I've been doing martial arts for a good portion of my life. So I love teaching and doing martial arts. So those are some other topics if you ever want to talk to me about that kind of stuff. I love it. I work for a company called Bunzl North America. Most people have never heard of this company. We are the quiet hand that runs the nation, so to speak. We manufacture and distribute all kinds of janitorial safety supplies. We're the largest distributor in North America of Purell hand sanitizer. We do those, Zamboni floor sweeper things that you see at like hotels and grocery stores. We sell those, things like that. So. So I'm a senior software engineer for them. I work on the web and mobile team. I focus primarily on the content management system that we have, which is Sitecore, as well as our e-commerce platform. So I do a lot of development on those two platforms specifically. Quick shameless plug, we will be talking about this today, but this is my open source project right now called Clarion. It's a tool for designing and scaffolding out design systems for your front-end projects. So we'll be using that today as we start building out. We'll actually be building a design system a little bit today, and we'll use that as one of our tools in that process. All right, so real quick, I have started out with a quick question for everyone. This idea of accidental architecture. Have you ever been on a site where you've been on one part of the site and you move to another part of the site and it's felt completely different from the original site? Clearly built by a different team or even different technology. That's accidental architecture, right? Or have you ever been on a site where all of a sudden as you go through, things stop behaving the way you thought they would? Things that you thought should be clickable are no longer clickable, or things don't behave the way you thought they should, or they're not consistent from one page to another. That's an example of accidental architecture. So just to give you an idea, and this is kind of the idea that of where I started with design systems, was I started building on our Sitecore platform, our content management platform, which is very component-driven, and I started building out these components for our marketing team so they could build out their sites and things like that. And I didn't realize it, but I was kind of building a design system with it, right? Didn't know that terminology or realize what I was doing. But I built it out. I was very proud of it. It worked really well. It was very consistent, made it very easy for them to build nice-looking sites. So I turned it over to our marketing team. They said, we need to build a site. I got them set up with everything they need, handed it over to them. And the result of it was a little bit surprising to me. And the reason is as you look throughout the site, you get all different kinds of design behavior in here. You got all these pinks, different size fonts, not even the same pinks throughout the site. Some are these kind of Pepto-Bismol pinks. Other ones are like hot pink. Some have text shadows. Others don't. They all fail the accessibility standards that our site has, right? Not only that, some of the images have drop shadows. Other images don't have drop shadows. Some text is styled with one font. I think there was 6 different fonts loaded on this site. Not to mention that each of the images was at least a meg in size. The background image, I think, was 6 megs. So the site was very slow, and they came to us and they're like, well, why isn't this working right? We're like, what? Like, no, hold on, let's backpedal a little bit. And I was a little bit surprised. My response and my reaction to that was I wasn't super jazzed about the implementation of something that I felt I put so much time into and I thought was really good, right? And they had taken that and kind of distorted it a little bit and made something that I felt was not as great as it should have been. So it got me thinking about, okay, well, how do I fix this? How do I get people to not do this or prevent them from doing that in the future, right? Without taking away some of the flexibility and things they need to be able to build the products that they want. And I started down this path of learning about design systems. But before that even, I just want to say it starts with brand. It starts with the brand, okay? And I heard this quote the other day, and I'm going to steal it from a podcast that I listened to. It says, don't just be a name. A name is not a brand. If a name makes a promise and lives up to that promise anywhere in the world, then it's a brand. And that's by the co-founder of Ritz-Carlton Hotel. So he's got a little bit of knowledge, I think, on creating a consistent brand across, large geographic area as well as many properties, right? So that got me thinking, and I think the reason why it was so frustrating for me to see the site the way it was because, for one, I felt it damaged the integrity of the brand of the site that they were trying to build, right? The user experience was slow because the size of the images that they had were slowing down the site. The colors were inconsistent. The pink items were not even clickable links. They were just pink to be pink to stand out. So that creates a frustrating user experience. So I felt like that damaged the brand, the integrity of that brand because of that inconsistency. The other thing is I felt like it damaged my personal brand a little bit, right? I built the platform that they then built that application on. And I felt like it was a little bit of a reflection on my personal brand, on what, my personal brand is that I want to be able to deliver quality software to my team and the people that interact with it, right? And so now when I see that quality software was not being conveyed through what I built, I felt a little bit personally affected on a brand level. So now when I want you to think about design systems, I want you to think about on a brand level, like what is the brand trying to communicate? And that will drive what we build with our design system, right? So a design system, there's a lot of words that float around a design system and what they are. And sometimes they get intermixed and sometimes they get interchanged. And I just want to kind of clarify that a little bit. So first of all, a design system, let's define that for a second. I really like, there's a free online book called Hack the Design System. I highly recommend it. It's a very short read, quick, but it's got a lot of great information. I think Adobe makes it. And this quote has been probably my favorite definition that I've been able to find so far on design systems. And it says, a design system is a living system of guidelines, reusable code, and design assets and tools that help organizations deliver consistent on-brand experiences at scale over time. And so as we start building out the design system today, we're actually going to be building it. You'll see how we can make that scalable and make it so that we can create a consistent brand for whatever we want to do with our design system. Now, a style guide is slightly different. A style guide is a documentation and guidelines of a specific implementation of the design system for a given brand or product, right? So our design system may have a core set of design fundamentals and things like that. We may have a way for outlining how those fundamentals get implemented. Now, the style guide is the specific implementation of that will say, here's our color palette, here's what will be, here's our rounded quarters, our border radiuses that we use throughout here, here's the font families that we use, things like that, that are the specific implementation of that design system. And last but not least, a pattern library. Now this one's a little bit wordy, with a lot of commas in there, but an organized set of related, reusable values, functions, and components, often containing code examples, design guidelines, coding standards, and use cases which are designed to create consistency, efficiency, and quality in the product, right? So we create pattern libraries Yeah, you'll see that most people are familiar with pattern libraries. You go to like Bootstrap or Material Design or Foundation or things like that. Those are really good pattern libraries where you can reuse similar patterns throughout the application, and they have a certain standard and guidelines that they follow when they build those, which are a manifestation of the design system. So going back to this idea of a design system, the pattern library and the style guide are actually products of your design system. You use the design system to build those assets out. And so that's why sometimes people get confused. Oh, a design system, that's just my style guide. Not really. Style guide is a product of your design system, okay? Now for us, we're a conglomerate we have many, many brands under our Bunzel umbrella, right? So for us, we need to be able to have a design system and a pattern library that is adaptable to multiple different style guides or different brand implementations of our design system. So we need to be able to brand and theme our design systems in a very flexible way. So for us, a design system is going to be very dynamic, whereas some people, they only have one brand that they're building their design system for, so their design system and their style guide are going to mirror each other very closely, whereas for us, our design system and our style guides may not mirror each other exactly, but the guidelines that are outlined in our design system will be prevalent throughout our style guides. All right, so benefits of a design system. Time saved on designing and building modules, right? So that way, as you build a specific component or a specific implementation of a design, that can now be reused throughout the application. You don't need to rebuild it every time you create a new feature or a new part of your product, right? You can reuse existing pieces. Time saved on site-wide changes. So if you're creating your component library or your pattern library in a meaningful way, you can make a change in a single place and allow that to propagate throughout your application. So if for some reason you're failing, you don't have the appropriate accessibility standards built into like your carousel or your nav bar, rather than having to go through all of your applications and fix that in all those different places, you can fix it in one place and then allow it to propagate out to those different aspects of your applications or properties. So there's a lot of time and efficiency saved there. Faster feature development and product launches. And it comes back to that idea of being able to reuse existing things, right? Rather than a developer going in and actually rather than going through the design process every time of having to rebuild a specific UI for every little feature, it's very convenient if someone can be like, okay, you can do it on a napkin even, right? They just draw it out like, oh, we need a modal here, we need this, and I know what they need because we already have those built out. I just take what we have and implement them so that we can, build that product that much faster. It's also very nice to be able to do real-time mock-ups with that, right? I can be able to just throw those components on a page with a little bit of mock data and be like, well, is this the UI that you're thinking of? Oh, boom, my UI is already done. I just need to wire it up to the appropriate data set and do the additional development in the back end that I need for it. I don't have to rethink all that stuff. Brand unity and scale, and that goes back to that idea of accidental architecture, right? If we're reusing this same set of pattern libraries throughout our application, our brand now has a promise, right? Every time we use that same component, they're going to get the same user experience out of that component wherever they are in the site. We don't have to worry about them trying to relearn a new UI every time they start interacting with a new feature on the site. They're already familiar with it, and as they progress through the site, they feel a little bit of ownership with it, right? They feel like they understand the brand that much more, and they feel comfortable with it. Visual consistency. Now this is really important, and it's a little bit different with brand unity and scale. Visual consistency in general is really important in terms of cognitive load for the user, right? When a user starts interacting throughout a site, it's a whole bunch of UXers in the crowd, he's nodding their head, yeah. Having that visual consistency, one, it's that learning process, right? They don't have to relearn the UI, right? Every time they move to a new thing, there's a cognitive tax every time they have to register a new UI element, even if it's as simple as just a difference in button style, right? If they go from one button style to another button style, there's just a little bit of tax that comes with that. And after a while, that starts to wear down on the user, and they get mentally fatigued from that. An interesting study happened where they went through and they had a site that had slight variations in the UI throughout the application, and in one application, and they had the other one where it's all consistent. And in both applications, they installed the same bug, right? Now, as the users went through, the one that had the consistent UI, most users forgot about or overlooked the bug that happened within there. Whereas the one where there was a cognitive tax with each of those things, when that bug happened, it just dropped them, right? They recognized that was too much for them at that point, and they remembered it. It stuck with them, and they felt like the site was just buggy everywhere. Even though there's only one bug in there, they felt like there was lots of bugs in there. They're like, oh yeah, it just felt really buggy. And it was, okay, yeah, there was that one bug, but the rest of the site performed as it should, but to them it felt like there was many bugs in there, right? So that having that visual consistency is incredibly important for smoothing out that user experience and allowing users to engage with the actual features of your site rather than having to worry about the design and think about the design as they move through. Teamwork and collaboration. Now this gets really important, especially as teams grow and scale, right? As you start having visual design team, a UX design team, a technical implementation or a front-end development team or whatever it may be, the more that you can communicate back and forth between those in a very consistent manner makes it so much easier to accomplish tasks, right? And there's a lot less frustration and friction that happens across those teams because, when someone says, I need a button, you add a button, and everyone across the board knows exactly what button's going to be implemented, rather than the UI person says, we need a button, the UX person interprets it a different way, and then the visual design or the actual implementer does just something totally different, right? And then all of a sudden they're like, why did you put that button in there? That doesn't make sense. That's not the right button. Well, there needs to be a consistent language across the board that can communicate more efficiently behind that, and design systems do a very good job with that. Reduce learning curve for new employees. This is something that I think is really important because it's for all teams, right? As you start implementing consistent patterns throughout the site, it's very easy for me to pull a new developer on board and say, hey, I need you to add a card component here or a series of card components, and here's the data source for it. And they just implement it. They don't have to rebuild something from scratch. And then I'm like, oh, wait, let's go through and rework what you did because we need to explain, why that color, you can't have white text on a hot pink background and, things like that. And the learning still can happen, but it doesn't need to happen all at once, and it's not as aggressive. It allows new employees to have guidelines in how to build and scale their application. So it's really important. Increase the quality of our products, and that goes back to the ability to, as you build these pattern libraries, and you'll see as we interact with them, as we start building these components, how you can test them in isolation and reuse them. And once you reuse them and you have these patterns set up, it's very easy to reuse that code that's been tested, tried and true, right? Rather than someone else implementing something new later or trying something different later. You have this tried and true method that maybe it's not working quite right. You can tweak it, and that will propagate everywhere. That way, all of your code gets the benefit of having the update without and not just having to go through and manually do it. And so you get a lot more consistency and quality out of your products. So this next slide, actually, I got from Benton Callahan. He's the president of Sparkbox up in Dayton, Ohio. I don't know if you guys are familiar with him. Super smart guy, really nice. I actually met him first through Columbus Web Group, actually. He's an awesome guy. But I just listened to a podcast where he said this quote, for every $1 spent on the design system, saves $3 in design and development effort. And if you can't take that to your manager as proof why design system's a good idea, well, I don't know, something's wrong, right? Everyone likes to talk in dollars once you get up high enough in the food chain. I think that's a good selling point if you really need to sell a design system to a management team. Now the next one, this is a little more interactive, shared language. Now I'm going to show a series of pictures, animated images, and I want you to tell me what you think the name of these things are, okay? It's a little quiz. Let's see what your UI knowledge is here. First one. All right, what's that thing called? Go ahead, yell out. Yeah. Ooh, all right, yeah. So we've got a modal, right? Fantastic. All right, what would you call this then? Growler or toast? I haven't heard growler before. I like that. Cool. A tout or an alert. Okay. Perfect. How about this? That one, yeah, actually I think it says tooltip on there somewhere. So yeah, hopefully that. Okay, so we heard a couple different responses. I was in a meeting where in that meeting, each one of these three things were called a pop-up. Okay? Now think about this. When someone comes back from the business and says, we need a pop-up to do X, Y, Z, what do I think of? It could be that one or that one or that one. I don't know. And now, when the business comes back, and I put in a modal because I thought that's what they wanted, and then really they wanted a toast or a growler. I like growler. I might take that. That's cool. There's frustration that happens there, right? There's some confusion. Now there's friction between teams or some inconsistency. Having a shared language on what things are called is a huge benefit to your team in terms of efficiency and communication. Everyone in your business should learn the names of these things. Like, there's no reason. These are not technical terms, right? People learn the names of their dogs. They learn the names of their kids. They learn, people learn new things every day. They can learn the names of these elements, and that will help with communication and reduce frustration that happens within the business based on a shared language, right? So when you speak to these, don't feel like when you speak to the business or when you speak to the sales team or when you speak to the marketing team, don't try to dumb down the names of things. Use technical names of things so that they get familiar with those technical names of things so that that communication can be more efficient, right? The shared language is really key, especially in your design system. Now, before I go any further, I just want to talk about existing design systems, right? I am not in any way advocating that you need to drop your UI that you have right now and start building a design system of your own from scratch. That's not at all what I'm advocating or what I'm recommending in any way. Partly because I spent a lot of time under the hood of these different UI libraries and these different pattern libraries. They're built by very intelligent people who do a very good job of what they do. And they're very worthy of using on a regular basis. There's nothing wrong with using those. And there's a good chance that they're open source. They may have thought of something that you haven't. So whenever I build something for myself, that's my own custom component, you better believe I'm borrowing some ideas from some of these guys because they've done a good job on doing their research and building things in a good, accessible way or in a with good design patterns involved. Now, with that being said, if you're going to use a third-party design system, and they've done a good job for the most part of making it available to you so that you can customize and tailor those design systems to your needs. A lot of them are built on SAS or style components or other things, right? So they've made it so that you can customize those so you don't get what everyone calls the bootstrap effect. Like, I can't build a site with Bootstrap because my site's going to look like every other Bootstrap site. Well, that's because you haven't customized it in any way and you're not tailoring it to your needs. They've done a good job of exposing variable files or settings files so that you can go in and tweak those and have them look and feel according to what you want within your brand. But I will say that if you are going to go down that path, I highly recommend you adhere to their design system. Don't try to build your own on top of it. And the reason why I say that is because it gets very complex. You're now fighting two different design systems at the same time, right? I tried to be very clever one time and tried to build a BEM implementation, which is a CSS syntax of block, element, was it module? Modifier, thank you. Block element modifier. It's a CSS syntax, class name syntax, and architecture to write your classes that didn't really jive with Bootstrap, because Bootstrap uses object-oriented CSS. And those have fundamental different patterns within them. And I was like, I don't care, I'm going to be hip and use BEM. And I tried to override it and try to do all these other fancy things. And it was not a very pretty site. And so I just give you that warning that if you decide to go down the path of a third-party design system and you decide to make it your own, your mileage may vary. Okay, you may end up with something that's awful and you may resent it later. With that being said, there's nothing wrong with starting with one of those existing design systems and then systematically building out or filling out your own design system and removing those aspects from the original. And that's kind of what we're doing with our e-commerce platform, right? We have Foundation UI for our framework, and we're starting to rebuild our own components to what we need and to our use cases, and we're just removing those from Foundation as we need them so that we can kind of slowly adopt our own design system, right? So there's nothing wrong with that either. Okay. 4 keys to a successful design system. This is my 4 keys when we're trying to build out either a feature of the design system or the design system itself, right? The first one is scope definition, development and testing, implementation and documentation. So the first part is defining your scope. You don't have to have, this is a common misconception. I've heard this many times about design systems. They say, this line is, you don't have to have a site before you build your design system, but you should have your user experience identified. So many times I've heard people say, don't start building a design system until you already have your site up, until you already have your site, existing and you've kind of vetted it out a little bit. And I think that's not correct. I don't think that's 100% correct. I think there's some elements of that you could, if you already have a site up and going, you can abstract patterns from. But before you start anything, before you start scoping out your different elements and things like that, understand the user experience that your brand is trying to communicate, right? You need to be able to say, here's what we want them to do. Here's our customer journey map as they get from one place to another. Here's how they interact with those things. Because that becomes a very important tool of identifying what you need, but it also becomes just as important to help identify what you don't need. And that helps fight against scope creep. And that's a big problem as developers or people get ideas and they start building ideas. Do you have a question? Oh yeah. So as they start building out different aspects of it, they start getting all these ideas about, oh, what if it did this? What if it could do this? And then you have to be able to tie that back to the user experience to say, here's where the user experience, here's how this ties back to the user experience. And if it doesn't, maybe we should table that until we figure out how it can or does tie back to the user experience. Yes, sir.
So I do have a question.
Yes.
Or a comment, maybe. So when you say that, though, the user experience or a pre-existing site, one of the things that whenever building out a website, I'm always like, the content needs to be done first. So when you make this statement, are you referring to just actually a design, whether it's a Photoshop sketch file or a prototype out there? You're saying that doesn't need to exist? Or are you saying the entire content as well as everything else?
So what I'm saying here is that as you start building any element of your design system, whether it's a component or just the design system itself, before you start that design aspect of it, you should understand what you want the customer to do or what you want the user to do in your application. That way, when you understand, here's the behavior that I want to drive through my application, that will govern how you craft your components, right? So even if you don't have your content built first, content first I think is a really good idea because that gives you the idea of, oh, here's the content that I have, and then here's how they go from one piece of content to another in that customer journey. I don't necessarily know that, I don't think that you have to have the content first, but you have to understand the customer journey and how those pieces of content tie together so that they can get where they need to be within the application. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so again, just for clarity, when you're saying a design system or component base, you're not necessarily talking about the design of the site, but it's just the identification of like core components and the languages.
No, it's just the design itself. So the design system, and that's I think where I think people get confused with design systems. Design system is not necessarily about building the specific design aspect of it, like the like mock-up and things like that necessarily. The design system is just a set of governing tools that drive everything behind it. So yeah, so I agree, yeah.
I just know that.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate that. Thank you. Cool. Any other questions on that? Any? It's okay. You're just going to miss your opportunity.
look at this.
All right.
We have a question over here in the corner from Ben
thank you.
Papalardo.
I don't know what I'm going to say yet. I just kind of have some feelings I want to get out because this is kind of personal to me. I think it's hard to know the scope of a design system and to truly know you need a component or something like until you kind of hit it, like in your requirements or whatever, you know? You're like, sure, you know, you need like buttons and an H1 and a, you know, paragraph style and like, you know, some form fields and stuff maybe. But like the more unique your requirements get, it's always the question of like, do I build a new component? Do I try to fit it into an existing component? Is that component going to be used everywhere? Do we put it in the design system or is it only used in this application? It's kind of hard to define a scope. The other way you could do is kind of start with an existing design system like Material or, you know, one of the other ones, and kind of just assume that you'll need most of the things that they have, but then you might kind of overscope and do things that you won't need. So
I think that is a super good point. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Did you?
yeah, go for it.
That's why I think that's kind of the idea of having your site first to then build your design system is kind of a backwards way of thinking. There are so many things that we know we're going to need, right? You're going to need those form inputs. You're going to need those H1 tags, that menu, right? Those are things we know we're going to need within the application, and so we can build our design system with those fundamental needs, right? And as our design system grows, just like that definition it talks about, it's living, right? It should grow and mature. And know that you're never going to get it right the first time, right? You're not going to get everything right the first time, and it's going to grow and it's going to develop, and you're going to change things and you're going to adapt things to make things more dynamic to whatever your use case may be. So I think you're absolutely right. And so that's why I don't like the idea of, just build it first and then kind of build the patterns after that. I think you build the patterns and then you start adapting the patterns to what you need as the user needs increase or as the scope changes, because that's going to inevitably happen within the application, right? Scope changes a little bit. People want something different. They realize, that's not what I wanted. I actually want it more like this. And so you got to be able to. It's got to be flexible and adaptable to whatever your needs are. Yes.
I make one comment also.
Yes, sir.
And it's just because I've spent so much time with Burton. Like I always see it as like, if you know you need to bake a cake, you need to figure out what the ingredients are first. Mm-hmm. And sometimes you can take it as like, I want to make a vanilla cake. So you know you need to have that ingredient, but there's some other pieces that you still need to go get. And you can have those ingredients that are used across many cakes, but it's like, what is the specific one? Sometimes those ingredients actually are the core piece that lead the design or whatever you're making.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's, and that's actually what we'll be looking at today, is because we'll be building our core design system, and implementing it into another application. And that application may have its own set of components that are more specific to the scope, right? What we're building is the core, the design system, the patterns, the rules, the guidelines that will govern how we build those things, and then be able to scope out from there. So defining your scope, if you already have an existing application, the first thing to do is obviously do a site audit. This is kind of fun. This is where you go through and identify that we have 50 different kinds of buttons in there. We have, all these different kinds of images, image styles, text styles, different fonts that we have in there, and kind of do an audit to see what you have, right? And then you kind of collect it all together, and then you could say, okay, well, we have all these things, and then you can identify what you need, what you actually need in there, what you need your buttons to do, what you need your carousel to do, what you need your nav bar to actually do, right? And so once you identify those actual needs, it's much easier to create that MVP, right? That minimum viable product. This is something that I fall prey to very often, is that as I start building things, I'm like, oh, I need a carousel. And I'm like, well, how does this carousel implement this? Or how does this carousel implement that? And all of a sudden I have this like Swiss Army knife of carousels that does like 500 things. Really, I don't need it to do 2, but you know what? My imagination just ran wild with it. And now I have this crazy bloated carousel that does so many things that I don't need to do just because I'm thinking that we might need it, right? I need to start with what we need first. And then I can start moving. Then as the scope changes or grows, then we can slowly increment and adapt those things to what we need. And that helps keep the bloat down and help keeps your code very nimble and dynamic. It's a really important thing. Yeah.
There's a question back in the room.
Thank you.
So with the do a site audit, so our site's gigantic. Our software is huge. We've got a lot of different implementations. If we did a site audit, it would take us like 2 weeks to do that full time. What do you recommend to keep that sort of more focused?
There's a number of different ways you can do the audit itself. A fun way to do it is identify what are your core pages, right? What are the core pages or the core aspects of your site that are getting hit all the time? Then from there, I actually like printing out the page and cutting them out, and then creating a little pile of buttons that I can be like, here's all of our buttons that we have. Which kind of buttons do we like? What do we like about these? What don't we like about these? Let's identify features of what we think and how these buttons should perform. Because buttons are kind of nebulous sometimes, right? Sometimes they perform actions. Sometimes they link to other things. Sometimes they can do any number of things, right? So we need to be able to identify what does our button do? How does it look? And how do we want to curate that to make it a consistent experience for those pages? So start with probably your most frequently hit pages, your frequently hit customer journey, or your most important customer journey is probably the more important one. Identify, if you have an e-commerce site, what does it take? What's the most important journey for the user to start on the shopping and get to the cart? All right, and then you identify that journey and say, let's start with these pages, and then we can scope out to our other pages. And once you identify that core button component, and you start touching other pages that aren't in that identified path, it gets very easy to update those and swap them out. So I would say start with that core, and then you can move out from there. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, and the other thing that was crazy for us, so we did a similar thing for our e-commerce platform, and we kind of went through and looked at buttons, is that the buttons were not styled in the same place. They were styled for each page or each component. Like they all had their own set of styles and features that were contained with each one of those, which means that is a significant amount of extra code we're shipping around for no reason, right? For a worse user experience. Not only is it worse because of the cognitive load that comes from all those different buttons, but now we have a bloated site that's going to be slow, right? So it just makes sense that, oh, do you know what? Let's put all of our buttons in one place in terms of styling, behavior, component, whatever, and then make that solid, right? Solidify our button component, and this is what we want to do. And then you can easily propagate that out to the other places, and it makes it so much easier to maintain too. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, so, yeah, I hope that answers your question. Cool, any other questions? All right, so the next one, design a representation of how the components will look and behave, right? And ideally, this would kind of be in isolation a little bit. You don't want to build your page and then build all the components in there and then be like, oh, okay, now maybe we can start abstracting those out into other places. Ideally, you'd say, okay, here are our buttons that we want to be able to reuse throughout the application. That way, as you build your pages or your layouts, you say, oh, I need a button here. And it's so much easier to say, grab that button and put it here, rather than saying, well, we need a button. How are we going to design that? And then try to abstract it out from your design, right? So much easier to build those components first and then implement them into a design and reuse them throughout rather than trying to reverse engineer it. Now, with scope, we have some fantastic tools available to us for helping communicate what those designs are going to look like, right? The one thing I am going to say is that these tools are fantastic and they do help us with that, but they are not necessary, okay? And the reason why I say that is because I know there are many technical coders or people who feel like they're like, I'm not a designer, I'm C# backend .NET engineer. I don't know the first thing about design. To start your design system, you don't have to crack open one of these tools. You can start with pen and paper if you want to, right? You want to be able to say, I need a drop down, right? And draw out the drop down. And then you can say, okay, well, how do we make that drop down consistent throughout the site? And start abstracting those out. You don't have to be proficient in any of these tools to start building your design system. These help. These are very handy, especially if you have large teams, but they are not required, okay? So don't feel like you have to be proficient in these tools in order to take advantage of design systems or designing or making your UI meaningful, okay? The other thing to think about is a couple of things to identify as you're building out your scope, right? Just a few to-dos, right? But these things become very important, and it's so much easier to do these up front than it is to try to identify them after the fact, right? Identify your color palette. What colors will you have in your color palette? How many brand colors? How will you, how will those integrate? Do you need to have different shades and tones? And, you just need to identify what those brand colors are going to be and how you can implement them within the application, lest we have the same situation with our Pepto-Bismol pink and hot pink scenario at the beginning of the presentation, right? The other thing is interactive states. How will things look when they're open and closed? Or how will they look when they're hovered over or when they are clicked or things like that? Those are things that you should be thinking about as you're building out these components that, hey, we need to make sure that we're addressing these as we're building things. A very important one is the focus state that is often overlooked. The focus state is, especially for keyboard users, as you tab through, identifying that thing is focused on so that keyboard users can interact with it appropriately, right? So those are things you need to be thinking about as you start building out and designing your application. Animations, what kind of animations will be on there? I don't know if you've ever, so frustrating for me if I'm on a site and animations are inconsistent, right? One thing's going super slow and another thing's like super fast across the site. It's almost like when you see a sci-fi movie and the android's freaking out and like the eyes are blinking out of sync. That's what it feels like to me, and I'm like, it like gets to me a little bit. And so identifying and creating consistent animations throughout the site is a key with that user experience, right? Typography. What kind of typography are you going to be using throughout the site? Identify like, oh, we're going to use, how many fonts are you going to use throughout the site? What kind of I'm interchanging fonts and typography. It's not correct. What kind of typography do you want to use in order to communicate what you want, the brand, through the site? And then what kind of fonts are those going to be, and how many fonts are you going to allow to be on the site? I'm going to throw this out there. I strongly feel that there should not be more than 3. And the reason why I say 3 is because if you have a monospace font, if you have a code or some kind of example, that's the 3rd, but most of the time it's going to be only 2, right? You're going to have a header or accent font and then a body font. And we'll talk about those when we start actually scaffolding out the design system itself. And that's for really important reasons, right? We talked about that cognitive load even as fonts change, there's a text that comes with that, right? Not only that, as the more fonts you add on a web page, the slower that page is going to load. And the more a jank you're going to see in the site as fonts load and start shifting around things and making things look different. Not a good idea. Keep it small, keep it simple, right? Media queries. What are your breakpoints going to be as you go throughout the application, and when, how small of a device do you need to be coding for, or designing for, right? Is this going to be a mobile application? Everyone likes to say mobile first, but in reality, there are some line of business applications that will only ever be used on a desktop. It's the reality, right? We like to have the idea of everything being super mobile friendly, but maybe that's not the reality, and we need to be able to build and design for that. Spacing, how big margins, paddings, all that jazz is going to be, because I don't know if you've ever been in a scenario where you've had one thing that is like 15 pixels, has a 15 pixel padding on it, and then the thing above it is far enough up, and it gets away with like a 13 pixel margin, and then you have to put something in between, and you're like, oh, do I go 13 or 15, 13 or 15? And it's noticeable if you don't, like it wasn't that noticeable before, but now that you have something in between, it's noticeable. So frustrating, right? Being able to identify that, all of a sudden when you say these are our margins, these are our spacing values that we use throughout the site, things just magically start lining up. And you're like, oh, this is so convenient. I don't have to wrestle with this every time, right? It's so much easier to implement. Iconography. Our e-commerce platform, this is a little side story, our e-commerce platform had 8 different sets of iconography implemented on it. Some were SVGs, some were images, some were font families. It was just a hot mess in there, right? We decided, you know what? No, we're going with one. We said, let's start with Font Awesome. We'll use Font Awesome. That's pretty good. It's got a lot of cool stuff, pretty much everything we need. And we'll just solidify it and go with one. And man, we've started hearing feedback. Oh, it looks so much cleaner. It looks more consistent. Oh, I like how it loads better. And all that stuff. You just start seeing these improvements when you start identifying these core aspects of your site. Shapes and borders, right? Are you going to have rounded buttons? Are you going to have border radiuses? Yeah.
Could you touch on maybe your opinion on SVG icons versus like icons baked into a font family?
Yes. So I will say that on an accessibility standard, on an accessibility spectrum, SVG icons are going to be better than font family icons. The nice thing also is that you can load only what you need with SVG icons, right? Whereas with font families, you have to load the font family. You get all of the icons, whether you need them or not. So, for example, Font Awesome has changed it so that you can use SVGs instead of font families, partly because of that. Also because you can dynamically load those as you need them. So you can lazy load your icons throughout your application, and it just speeds up the performance of the site in general. So I think as an industry, more and more people are moving away from font family icons and moving towards SVG icons because of their benefits. Not only do you get accessibility, performance benefits, but you get accessibility benefits. You can have text embedded in there. You can have content available only to screen readers, so that they like, for example, if you just have a cart icon in the upper right-hand corner of the screen, there's no text there to tell a screen reader to say, oh, that's the cart icon to get to your cart, right? If you're using a font family, because it just sees that as the I tag or whatever you're using to define your tag. Whereas with an SVG, you can have text in it that says cart, go cart button, or go to cart, or something like that, so that screen readers can get to that a little more accessibly. Now you can do that within your HTML markup itself as well, but SVG has a lot of nice features with it that come with that. It's also, again, very performant because of the way the markup is scalable vector graphics, right? They can be sized any size without compromising the design of the icon itself, as well as it just loads very, very quickly. Did you have a comment? We're gonna have a debate. Is that what's happening?
Pet peeves about icons, and especially when you're creating your own family, consistency in strokes, widths, and the spacing of those imagery, the imagery that you're creating.
Yeah.
Outside of it being from a different family, but why sometimes I lean more towards the font size or using font is because your font's not going to scale, and you can maintain it at the same width, whatever it is. So little changes of a stroke around it is going to be the same stroke across a large screen or a small screen. You're updating the font size at probably more of a global level as opposed to the individual image that's scaling. It's a very small thing, but it's one of my pet peeves. So when creating an icon, a family of icons, that they're all of consistency. As it's similar to the button thing. Once you start realizing it, it'll keep you up at night. It's awful.
We'll have to have a conversation about that, Kevin. Interesting.
There's different use cases for it. I think Burton explained it in a great way. And then you subtly said the one thing that you could put in your markup, the explanation of what it is. In CSS, there's no speed, so text in there for
Right. Yeah. I don't know how the adoption is on that.
we can debate that.
Yeah. It's going down. That's a valid point. And not that it's wrong to use icons, because font icons, because you can, they're good. You can still take advantage of them, and there's still many font families that do it. But I feel like the industry as a whole is shifting towards SVG icons.
I bet when you put this presentation together, you thought, 11 a.m. on Saturday, I'm not going to be debating SVG font. Yeah.
I never know what to get when I'm hanging out with Kevin, so I was ready. So, awesome. Any other questions? In general, if you got a question, let's hammer it out.
There's a question or comment from Ben Popolo.
Thank you.
Just in my experience, I think the sneakiest of these are definitely the media queries and the spacing. They're the ones that you don't think about immediately, and maybe unless you've kind of been burned by it before, you don't think of it right away.
Yep.
And in my current project, we're on a team and there's multiple designers, and we didn't think about media queries and spacing right away. And the problem we got was different max and min widths for forms and tables. And so there was one data table that had a max width, and you could zoom out, and it was just this kind of skinny column in the middle, where other data tables didn't have a max width, and they would span the full width, and so you'd get to see all your columns and not have to horizontal scroll. And then I don't know, just even forms being left aligned or centered, or there's just a lot of decisions that you have to make that kind of go unseen until you kind of get burned by them. But having it up here and saying establishing media queries, I don't even know if it's media queries, but how you're going to handle max and min widths of pages, that I think is something that either fits into one of these or could also be on the list.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and actually, as we scaffold out with Clarion, I'll show you how we've kind of helped bridge that gap a little bit and make it easy for people to pick up on those things. Yes, Kevin.
Now you have the question juices going. I don't know. But one of your comments earlier about the interactive states, like I'm glad you brought that up. New ones that people don't think about are also like the touch and like the press. And so when building these out, also looking at like how someone interacts with it on a touch device. But one of the things that, it's difficult to do this, like you may create like a primary, a secondary like theme, and you may have the primary color and it's like default state be one color, and then the hover goes to like a dark color. But then if it's on a dark background, then it doesn't pass accessibility guidelines. And there's different things that you can do. You can namespace it, which we made jokes about that earlier. But there's also like CSS variables that exist. However, you then almost have to create a rule for those like hover states. So it's almost better to have like two different classes in CSS for that same look for like its initial state and then the default state. I would never recommend someone having like primary button default, primary hover light. Like you could do it that way, but that would just be probably obnoxious for the average person.
Yeah.
It's just something to consider when building out, and thinking these things through.
Yeah, absolutely.
I get burned by that all the time.
Yeah, no, I think that's a super valid point that, as, implementation, right? Implementation is probably one of the hardest parts. It's so easy to theoretically be like, here's how we're going to build this out and here's how they're going to be implemented. And then all of a sudden somebody implements it in a way that you never thought they would ever do. And sometimes you're like, what were they thinking? And sometimes you're like, what was I thinking, right? And so it's really important and that's why I think it's important to be able to be flexible with your implementation of your design system, because you don't always know what's going to happen with it. You need to keep it flexible.
Burton, you're great. I said like, that's why the microphone's here. Give you compliments throughout. And also, we have about 2 hours at most left.
At most?
Keeping you track of time.
Okay. We can do this.
I'll try to not disrupt anymore.
No, it's okay. I like it. My co-host today is Kevin Mack. All right. So actually, one of the ones that I found that people fail to think about first when at the beginning of their development process or the beginning of their design process is voice and tone. Understanding the voice and tone of what your brand is trying to communicate and what you want your site to look like is going to be very critical. So for example, if you're going to have more of a playful, light tone to your site, you may want to have more rounded borders or border radiuses throughout your application, because that communicates more of a playful tone in and of itself, right? So if you identify that voice and tone, that's going to help make some of those design decisions as you start building out your application. So it's really important to identify those things beforehand so that your design can mirror what your voice and tone is going to be for that rest of the application. Whereas if it's going to be very corporate formal, having very squared corners, right angles is going to be more appropriate. It doesn't make sense to have it be corporate formal and then have all these like bubble buttons throughout the application, right? It just kind of clashes. Voice and tone, you got to be able to identify that up front. That's going to help influence the choices that you make in terms of design and how you implement it. Performance standards, how fast you want your page loads times to be. That way you say, hey, we want it every time no more than 2 seconds. That's going to help just determine, first of all, image sizes that people put in there, number of fonts, number of different things that you load in there, size of your markup or size of your CSS. It's all of a sudden if you start throwing in all these jQuery extensions and plugins, that's going to start slowing down your application, and that's going to require that you make different decisions with your design and your implementation. Right? You need to be able to identify those up front. Accessibility standards. I can't emphasize this one enough. I think most of us are aware of the Domino's debacle, right? That just happened recently with them getting sued for a completely inaccessible site, and it went through, and which now has kind of opened the door for the possibility of other sites that are not accessible to also have lawsuits filed against them. So having an accessibility standard in place is important to start from the beginning. That way you know, oh, I can't have that lime green button with white text. That's inaccessible. People who are colorblind or visually impaired will not be able to see that button, right? You need to be able to identify those up front. Like for us, also, we do business outside of the U.S. Canada has much more strict accessibility standards than we have. We need to be able to identify those and make sure we're meeting those standards within our application or our design system. Yeah.
I have a comment on that. A lot of times also like the battle of like the UI designer developer versus like the design marketing team. Mm-hmm. They may not have as much knowledge or awareness of the standards that exist for the web. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes it can be, you can use that to your advantage to make better design and like align to heuristics of the web, because a lot of like marketing people that have no web experience are designing these things that align to their idea of what best design is, but it's for like print or some other material like packaging.
Yeah.
And they don't know how to translate it to the web. And so bringing in the accessibility standards can reduce some of the complexities of a component and make it be something that's actually more effective. And you can win your battle because you can't argue against it. Just bring up any of the previous examples where someone got sued.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So on accessibility standards, Canada, you said, has much kind of tighter standards. What do they go by? Any type of like open guidelines, or do they have a specific set of guidelines that are law, or how do they do it versus the U.S.?
Yeah, so U.S. doesn't have any right now. I mean, the guidelines are there, but they're not enforced, right? Canada right now, I think, is WCAG, WCAG. I don't know how people. I call it WCAG, but yeah. But they're. Right now, their standard is 2.0, and I think this year it goes to 2.1. So, and there's certain standards that need to be adhered to in order to meet those levels. So being aware of what the standards are, or even establishing. I think everyone should establish a standard in their team. It's not just a if, it's you should. Because think about it, it's not about necessarily accessibility, it's about inclusiveness, right? You want to be able to reach as many customers or as many people as you possibly can with your applications, and to say, oh, sorry, no, we want to go with this design, even though it says no to all these customers, right? Doesn't make sense. I can't think of a business that would be like, no, throw away those dollars. We don't want that. Doesn't make sense, right? We want to be able to include as many people into our applications as we possibly can, so setting those standards is critical. And last but not least is technical constraints, right? What devices am I making this for? What browsers are my users using? Are they still on Internet Explorer 9 or 11 or what it is? We still support Internet Explorer 11 with our development, so we have certain constraints that come with that, right? So we need to be aware of what those constraints are as we build and design our different applications. Now, something that I've heard too is that people would say, it's too constraining, right? I can't do the things that I want to with, oops, I skipped. There we go, yeah. No, it's too constraining. I can't do the things that I want to with it. You're trying to tell me that as a designer, I'm a creative person. You're trying to put this creativity and cage it. And I'm just going to throw this quote at you because I think it's very apt, right? No. Creativity thrives under intelligent constraints. That's Carmine Gallo, right? That's where creativity really happens, is understanding your constraints and being able to do amazing things with it, right? So these constraints aren't here just to be annoying, right? They're intelligent constraints, hopefully. There's a reason why those constraints exist, but you need to be able to be creative within those parameters, and that's why we don't have machines building everything for us. We have humans building it so that you can use that creativity to take care of things that we need to. All right, so any other questions on the scope? That was just the scope aspect of it. Okay, hopefully this is going to go a little bit faster, but development and testing. The idea behind development and testing is that we build abstractions that we can then reuse, right? Bootstrap does it by abstracting away their functionality in jQuery functions, and they have CSS classes that you can apply to things to repeat that behavior throughout the application, right? So CSS, reusable design tokens, this idea of having this core set of values that then get reused throughout your application so that you don't have to refigure them out every time. Reusable classes and style patterns. In HTML, how do we isolate and reuse our markup in an easy way and abstract it out for quick modification, right? And then logic, how do we get our JavaScript to be not only reusable, but also how do we make it so that it's easy to maintain, right? We need to be able to identify those things. Ooh, a token? So a token would actually be a lot of the things that we talked about on the scope slide, our spacing, our color palette, our anything that we're going to be reusing throughout the application. We're going to pull those out into basically variables, right? We're going to reuse them as variables throughout the application. And I'll show you how we do it within Clarion, and then hopefully that'll help shed a little more light on design tokens. So on the concept of building meaningful abstractions, I found that if your abstractions don't meet these three criteria, their likelihood of being adopted and used is very low, okay? So they need to be flexible. They need to be able to fit whatever use case people are going to be throwing at them. They need to be able to adapt to whatever need that comes up from it. They need to be reliable, which means we need to be able to test them and make sure that they're going to be able to stand up to whatever we use, and that they're going to be consistently usable across the application, right? And then last but not least, easy to use. If they're not easy to use and you have to jump through all these hoops and go do all these backflips to try to use someone's component or use someone's pattern library, they're never going to adopt it, and they're just going to complain about it. And they're like, oh, it's so hard, right? I don't like doing that. I'm just going to build my own. It's easier that way, right? So you need to be able to make sure that it's easy to use. And these kind of follow, UX, even if a developer is not a UX developer, so to speak, they're in charge of UX in some way, right? They need to be able to have that mindset as they build these components that they're creating a user experience with that for other developers. Development tools, this is in terms of our CSS and making our CSS reusable and abstractable, right? So CSS and JavaScript, a lot of, or style components. A lot of people are moving or pushing towards having that set up in JavaScript so that they can reuse them throughout their JavaScript and style their components using that instead of using CSS. Pre and post processors using Sass, less stylus, post CSS. That's kind of my wheelhouse personally. I really enjoy the format and styling that comes with that. You'll see it with Clarion. Utility libraries, these are picking up a lot of tailwind. No, just kidding. They're picking up a lot of momentum, right? And that's the idea of styling your markup with reusable CSS classes instead of using CSS files, so that all of your styles exist in your markup rather than in a separate file, and then you just tweak the markup whenever you need to. There's pros and cons to that. Everyone has their opinion on that. I'll try to keep mine to a minimum so you can make your own decision. So those are a lot of ways that we can try to abstract out that CSS and make it reusable and meaningful. Now the other one that we have are obviously our front-end development tools that help with our markup and our JavaScript to pull those out and make them reusable and abstract them in meaningful ways to reuse throughout our applications. Very popular, and there's a reason why these are so popular, right? Angular, React, and Vue, those are the big three. There's many more that are available to do that. And actually one of them, you guys know what that one is? Native web components. And that's actually what we are playing with, building our design system with today. We will be building it with native web components, and specifically with Stencil.js. The reason why native web components are so handy, first of all, they've been around forever. They've been around since HTML5. They never got quite that much momentum and traction from the start, and that's partly because browser support was terrible with them, and that's partly because other frameworks do a really good job of doing that, and people are like, well, why would I go to this native web component setup that isn't well adopted, whereas I can just use React or Vue, and it does adopt that, which is totally makes sense. Now, the only problem that we have now is we have companies that either buy other companies or they have different teams building things that, we have all of these different applications that use different frameworks. So for us, our e-commerce platform is written on AngularJS 1.3, a little old school. Our content management platforms using Vue.js. We have a whole bunch of .NET applications. We have some PHP applications. We have some Node.js applications. So now what do? We just say, all right, everyone, now you're using such and such framework. We need to rewrite all the front ends to use this new framework in order to use our design system? Doesn't really make sense, right? Doesn't jive. A lot of teams will probably, burn you at the stake because they don't want it. They're like, no, I'm a React developer. There's no way I'm going to Vue or vice versa or whatever, right? Whereas native web components are platform agnostic. They don't care what platform you use. They're part of the HTML spec. So you can build these abstractions using native web components and then implement them wherever you like throughout applications. Now, they're not 100% supported through all of the frameworks, but they're pretty good. And we will today be using native web components built with Stencil and implement them into a Vue.js application. So the other thing is Storybook. We'll use that today as well. Storybook is a fantastic testing tool and a tool designed to help you test and build your components in isolation. And so we will tinker around with Storybook today as well and build some components with that. All right, implementation. Now this is a key step that is really important in terms of making it easy for people to implement your design system, right? How do applications now implement your design system? What is the delivery method in which they get that? How do they implement it? And how can and should they extend the design system? Again, you want them to hopefully adhere to your design system. You don't want them having that Frankenstein design system that they just took yours and then just went to town and did their own thing, right? You want to have them follow those guidelines and adhere to those so that they can stick with it. Documentation. Who is responsible for documenting and governance of the design system, right? This is really important to figure out before you start building it. Otherwise, it's like everyone's pointing their finger and then you have a very poorly built, poorly implemented design system because the documentation is terrible, right? Where can I find it and how easy is it to use? So right now, for us, our design system documentation is all in a wiki in Azure DevOps, which is not a good place to have documentation for a design system. It's a little tricky for people to get to and for them to remember how and where to find things and not really searchable, et cetera, et cetera. So figure out what are good ways to document this. There are awesome libraries out there. If you're a Vue.js user, VuePress is specifically designed for, even if you're not a Vue.js developer, anyone can use it. It's super easy. You write your documentation in Markdown files, and then it just serializes them and builds your site for you, a really nice documentation site for it. Actually, the Clarion site is built using VuePress, which is awesome. I highly recommend it. Finding out how to make it document it so it's easy for people to learn about and consume your design system, right? How, when, and where to use or not to use aspects of your design system. Now, this is something that's really important, and I think a lot of design systems do a fairly good job of it. The perfect example right here is actually Microsoft's Fabric. This is their documentation on a toggle button. They say, all right, here's where and how you use a toggle button. Here's specifically where you don't use a toggle button. Don't use a toggle button for these things, right? You want to be able to communicate that so that your design system keeps its integrity, right? So that UI is consistent throughout the different properties or throughout the application itself. Really important to identify those things. And then a common just pattern for designing, documenting your components and things like that is the name of the properties that go into that component, the values that it accepts, whether they are a specific set of values, whether it's a Boolean string, icon, whatever, description of what that property does for the component, and then any default values that that component may have. And so as we start building out our components, you'll start to understand this a little bit better. All right. Documentation examples. These are just a couple of really awesome, well-documented design systems that are out there that you can go look at right now. This last one is actually Adele at uxpin.com. That's a list of design systems, and they give you some metadata on that, like what it was built with. And so if you're like, oh, I'm building a React design system, what's an example of a React design system that I can follow? You can go in and go to that website and look it up and find it. You can also type in awesome design systems, and there's a GitHub repo that has a list of design systems that you can also peruse. It's really fun to look at. Let's see, additional resources just on design systems itself. Some really great books. Design Systems, that's a Smashing Magazine book. Fantastic. Atomic Design by Brad Frost. He was kind of one of the first preachers of design systems for web early on. He also wrote the Atomic Design Pattern, which was very inspirational to me in terms of building design systems. And then that one, Building Design Systems by Sarah Veselov and Tori Davis. That was a fun read. It was very light, easy to pick up. The way they laid things out and explained things, I was like, man, it's effortless to learn these things. They just did an excellent job writing that book. And then additional concepts in terms of CSS architecture down there at the bottom. You almost beat up the godfather of atomic design?
Like IT CSS on there.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
It's and the idea, the principle behind it is architecting your CSS in a way so that it actually cascades, right? It's inverted triangle, so it's this idea of, that's what IT stands for, inverted triangle, is that, things that are less specific versus things that are more specific, and cascading those, actually allowing the cascade in CSS to happen so that as you write rules higher or lower, and actually that's kind of how Clarion's implemented, so you'll see that here in a second. Any questions? Sure, anything. I just liked it because it means clarity, or like clear understanding or clear sounding. And so that was the purpose of the framework, was to make things very clear and easy to understand. And so we'll go through that and explain that a little bit more. Oh, yeah, it is. Oh, many a time. So maybe subconsciously I chose it because of that. Yeah, that's right. We can. Yeah, absolutely. Let's do that. And then we'll go over what we're actually doing today. I know, sorry, it's a bit of preamble with that, but I just want to make sure you guys had an understanding of design systems and then had tools that you need if you need to go and sell design systems or explain design systems to your team or management. All right. Back. It's a quote that that came up during our conversation that I want to share real quick, was the idea that if we built software the way that if we built buildings the way we build software, we'd pretty much all be dead. With a lack of standards and a lack of consistency and guidelines that govern the way we build things, provides a lot of room for error and a lot of room for failing architecture in a lot of ways. So. That actually kind of segues into what we're talking about. So the challenge that we're going to be doing today in terms of the workshop is, from the development aspect, we'll be building native web components with Stencil and the Clarion framework to style and design it, take advantage of our reusable components. We will then publish that to NPM, and then we will consume that design system in a Vue.js application, okay? If we have time. So to get started with that, there's a couple of things you can install on your computer. The first one is the Clarion CLI. So that's just npm install globally and then Clarion. And then npm install G, and that's a Vue CLI. So we can scaffold out a Vue application and then plug in the design system into that. Now the repo that I will be building from, so that if you want to follow along, I'll keep committing and you guys can pull it down and keep looking at it, is right here at this URL. It's break-stuff/CWG for Columbus Web Group -design-system. So you can pull that down and follow along, and as I commit, you can pull down, or if you just want to code along with me, you're welcome to, or if you just want to sit back and relax and watch, you're more than welcome to as well. I'll try to explain everything as we go through so that everyone's familiar with what we're working on. Cool. So what we're going to do is just something very simple. I just grabbed a couple of UI elements off of a couple of our properties, and commonly, a card component, right? A lot of people would call this a card component. So we're going to be building a card component, as well as some buttons as well. So with this, it's going to be, obviously we have an image on top, so we're just kind of defining the scope right now. So we have an image that sits on top of a headline of some kind. It looks like it needs to be flexible enough that it could be a link or static text for that headline. We have a sub-headline on some of those, but not on others, so we need to be able to have a sub-headline with that. And we have some body content that needs to be flexible enough to take either static text or other components if we need it to. And then we have a footer that needs to be able to take our call to actions if we need to, either one or many call to actions. So that's kind of the scope of what we'll be building today. Any questions with any of that? Cool. We'll get as far as we can. We'll give it a shot. So the first thing I want to show you is, I'm going to pull up my command line tool, and I'm just going to scaffold out real quick. And let me clear this. Zoom in so everyone can see. What's that? Size up? Is that not working? Oh, yeah. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do, I've already installed Clarion, so I did npm install -g -Clarion. So I'm just going to scaffold out a basic application. New, so Clarion new. And it's going to ask me a couple of questions. It's going to say, do you want a default starter application, or do you want to manually configure it? So I'm going to say manually configure so you can see what's going on under the hood. So from here I can say whether I want a starter project, just the style, the styles with the architecture, or if I want just the architecture. And each one of those is going to play a different role. We'll use each one today so you can see why and how we'd use each one. So I'm just going to do starter project for right now. I'm just going to do, I don't even know what, oh, okay, I'm in the right folder. Let's do Columbus Web Group, Clarion test for the name of my project. And it's going to say, do you want to use Webpack, Parcel, Gulp, or Grunt? I like Webpack a lot. You want to use SCSS. This is now, so Webpack, Parcel, Grunt, that's what tool is going to use to build my project, right? Some people have some preference over another of what tool builds and compiles their project into the final solution. I like Webpack. Other people like Grunt or Gulp. Parcel is a kind of a new kid on the block. I don't have roll-up support yet, but I think probably coming up here soon I will build roll-up support into it. And then you can choose what style formats you want them to be in SCSS, which is a Sass format, which resembles more closely like actual CSS. Sass, which is a little more Ruby-ish format, and then Less, which is another format as well. I'm going to use SCSS, and let that scaffold out my project for me. It'll take a second because it'll install my dependencies and everything. Hopefully our internet is running swift. So like you're saying you can't have like SCSS and less in the same project? Yeah, I wouldn't recommend it. Partly because you couldn't share resources between those two file formats. So if I wanted to, let's say, use a color, but all my values are set up in SAS, I couldn't use those values in my less files. And so I would say you'd want to stick to one format. It's less easy to work in than SAS is. The reason why SAS came after less, it was kind of the, hey, this could be better. And I think they did a good job with it. All right, so I'm just going to open Visual Studio Code. And I'm going to open that file that I created, Columbus Web Group, what do I call it, Clarion Test. I'll just explain what comes with this. Can you guys see that okay? Need me to zoom in more? Is that good? Good? Okay. All right. So what comes out of the box with this is obviously Webpack is the bundler that we chose, right, to bundle and process all of our styles or whatever. If we're using TypeScript, we can use it to also process our TypeScript, things like that. Post CSS. Now this is a CSS post processor. So what that means is that after we compile our code from SAS into CSS, post CSS will go through and do an additional tasks on that compiled CSS. So here we have two. The first one is auto prefixer. And what that will do is that will go through, this is important if you've identified what technology constraints you have. So if you need to go back and support older versions of browsers, what it will do is it will take your styles that you've created and automatically generate the appropriate CSS to meet that browser's needs so that your styles can be consistent across multiple browsers, right? The other thing is CSS Nano. And what that will do is that will go through and shrink down your CSS significantly. So what it will do is not only will it remove unused CSS, it will simplify the CSS into a way that is in like shorthand notation. So that will make things smaller as well. So it'll take all those things and kind of shrink them down as much as it can so that you have a small, fast bundle to serve. Cool. So then the other thing that comes, actually let's just spin this up so you can see. Oops. Run dev. See what our final result is. Make sure it's running okay. Yes, all right, so it's running okay. It also has a built-in web server so that you can spin it up. It has hot module reloading. You can, tweak things on the fly and it'll update for you automatically. Now, those are just kind of nice things. The thing that really makes this useful is that within here we have a style framework. Okay, now this framework is set up in kind of like we were talking about, the inverted triangle, the ITCSS setup. In that the items that are higher up in the folders, I mean, there's numbers in there. A lot of people are like, oh, numbers, blasphemy, right? You never prefix your folders with numbers. But there's a reason for that, and that is because that's the order in which that CSS will get implemented in your final style sheet. And the reason for that is I want it to be clear to people, if I write a style in my elements folder, in my elements section, but then I have the same style in my pages section, that pages section is going to override what's happening in the elements section, if that makes sense. So I just want to make sure that as you add styles, you know exactly what's overriding what and where. This is very clear, very easy to understand. Here are my styles, here's the order in which they're being implemented, so you can fully comprehend the cascade aspect of CSS, right? And that's very nice because now you can set up a theme. You can set up, let's say you have a generic link style. Maybe in a specific page that has, for some reason, a different brand variation or a different style variation that you need to have represented apart from the rest of the site. I don't know if that's always a good idea, but maybe you do, right? You can, in the pages section, override that link, and it will apply appropriately for that page. So it gives you an architecture so that you can apply your styles in a meaningful way. So now the other thing that it comes with is within the abstract folders, it comes with a framework for actually using and reusing styles, okay? So functions and mixins. Functions are just like in JavaScript or any other programming language, you execute a function and you get a value back, right? So that's what functions are for, whereas mixins, similar to that, they just have a different use. You execute a function and you get CSS back. Okay, that's really the main difference between functions and mixins. One is you get a single value back, and one of them you get CSS back. So what we get with that is first, we have our values, our variables set up in here. And these are our design tokens, right? These are our reusable aspects of our application that we're going to take advantage of. So for example, we have a default base font size. So we'd say, okay, do you know what? All of our applications are going to start 16 pixels, which I think is, in general, unless you have a font family that is especially large, that is a good default font size for accessibility and readability purposes. Content width, that's going to be the max content width of your containers on the site. And so if we look back, I'm going to expand this for a second, hold on, so I can switch back and forth. That's going to be the fixed width that shows up on the page. Now, a lot of people would be like, oh, that's too skinny, but actually that's one of the best widths for reading a blog article. Your eye tracking, that's one of the best widths. This is about 600 pixels. I felt like it was too skinny until I learned that, and I was like, that makes sense. I actually like that now. So if you have a blog type article, having a skinnier width, there's some, yeah.
There's a formula that exists for the font size versus the width of the container.
Yeah.
But like at 16, that's probably the right size.
Yeah, I don't know what that formula is. I remember reading it though.
Yeah, it's like common vertical or line height's 1.5, whatever your font size is.
Yep. Yeah, and actually I think there's a default line height in here. Yep, there we go. Line height base is 1.5 pixels, 1.5. Don't set it on pixels. That's never a good idea. So then fonts, right? Here's our 3 fonts that we have set up in here. There's 3 here, but don't worry, these are all native fonts, so that there's not installing new fonts. So if you feel like, whoa, he said 2, but there's 3, well, none of these fonts are actually installing anything new, so it's actually using the default font family. But again, you should rarely use more than 2. If you have a technical site, for some reason you're using a monospace font for displaying code or something like that, take advantage of that 3rd one. But in general, it's usually 2 is the ideal number.
Another important thing with fonts, I meant to say this earlier when you were talking about this, it's each font's weight counts as a font download. So when you're downloading, it's considered another font. So if you have 2 fonts in your system, they're light, normal, and bold, that's actually 6 fonts. Unless it's a system font.
Yep. Yeah, so when you go through and like if you go to Google Fonts and it allows you to choose all those different weights, there's a reason as you start clicking more, it's going to give you that warning like this is going to be slower, 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 because it's going to download all those different font variations for you. So it's important to keep in mind as well. Exactly, yep, that's a variable in SAS, and that's a token would be a reusable variable. So again, we have font sizes here. Now, keep in mind that as this gives you a little bit of opinion to it as well, right? This already is kind of making some decisions for you. If you need to change it or want to go a different route, you absolutely can. But for example, font sizes, these are all in rems instead of in fixed pixels. Part of that is for scalability reasons. As people zoom in and zoom out on your application, you want that font size to be scalable and respond to that appropriately. So they're in rems here. If you decide to change that to something different, obviously you have that ability. Line height base, 1.5, like Kevin said. Bless you. Spacing sizes, here's our space sizes right here so that we can have, different margins and paddings on our components and items within our layout. I'll show you how to use those in a minute. Our color palette. This is our out-of-the-box color palette that gives you, technically it gives you two brand colors to work with, right? Your primary and your secondary brand colors. The rest are more communication colors. Success, info, warning, danger, light, and dark. They're either for communication or for contrast. So light and dark are going to be used for creating contrast throughout your application, either borders or light background, dark background, etc. Color variation. So one thing that I want to show you is that the theme colors, Clarion itself will scaffold out a color palette for you based on these colors. So if I go to project, if I spell it right, that works better. projectclarion.com, and this is a documentation site for the tool itself, and this is written in, with ViewPress, like I said before. If I go to the, I think it's functions, and I go to color functions, it's going to tell you how to use those, but I just want to show you real quick. It'll start, here's the color palette that's generated based on those colors for you, right? There's a base color, and that's the color you've identified in that palette, but then it'll also create a dark and darker version, as well as a light and lighter version for you. So it'll start scaffolding out a color palette that you can then use and interact with. So as you hover over something, if you want a lighter version of that color, you can use the light version or the lighter version to show that, indicate that interaction is happening, right? Rather than trying to go through and be like, oh, with that color picker and drag it around and be like, oh, I think that looks like a good color to go as the lighter version, right? This actually will kind of, programmatically does it, but it'll build out your palette for you so that you can now have variations of those colors easily accessible for you. So secondary, success, info, warning, light, base, and dark, light and dark. Now, as you can see, one of the things that it also does for you that is it has an accessibility standard built into it of using the 2.0 standards, the WCAG 2.0 or whatever, where it says it needs to have a certain amount of color contrast. And so these colors are actually, the text colors are being generated by Clarion as well, so that it's an appropriately contrasting color for the background. So as you go through, you'll see it go from a black font to a white font because the contrast is too different or is getting too close. And so it'll switch to an alternate color so that it will be accessible for users. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Even though that they're off
Yeah. Maybe it's projecting and we got light coming in. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, so as you can see, it'll switch those colors for you. There's tools in place for you so that your application still meets certain standards. You don't have to use those if you don't want to. It's just helpful. That way you're not having to try to guess every time. So yeah, based on our color palette, it'll generate those colors for us so that we can interact with them. And then the color variation means that if you want it to, you can increase that number and it will make the lights lighter and the darks darker, right? Or if you wanted to reduce it, you could make those less different from each other. if that makes sense. Breakpoints, there's our media queries right there. If we need to, looks like I need to update my Clarion installation because I actually have a triple extra small. Oh no, wait, it's right there. Double extra small for 320. Never mind, sorry. So again, that's set up, that's using rems instead of pixels so that as users scale up their screen or scale down their screen, it will automatically adjust for that accordingly, the content. Z-indexes. I don't know how many people have ever gone to a site where, or been in a code base where they have to go in and modify the Z-index of something and you need it to show up on top. What do you usually do? You just hammer in a whole bunch of nines, right? You just go, oh, I need this to show up on top of everything. And then they go 999999999, and that'll just make it go hopefully on top of whatever it is you want it to go above. The problem is that when you actually go through and check your site and you find yourself constantly battling these Z-indexes, like, oh, who can race to the top and when do these get implemented? So having a set pattern and a set framework around how and when you use your Z-indexes is a tremendous time saver and a big headache. Hopefully remove a lot of headaches while you're coding. Ooh, good question. So there are different effects and things that you can do by having a negative Z-index. So if you want to have like a button kind of have a ripple effect with a color, like if you hover over it and have it, it's like white and then you want it to go blue as you hover over it, you can do that by modifying the Z-index and animation and have that ripple effect happen. Let's see what else. As you interact with different layers of things, you may want something to have that background to have a -1 so that it always is behind whatever. So if you want, what's it called? What's that? Parallax, thank you, where you have animations move at different times. You may want to have a negative index for something on that. So then a trump would be, I would say, a short-term solution for a problem that you have. Trump should be used very sparingly and very temporarily, right? That's like, oh man, we got to get this hot fix out tomorrow. This modal is not popping up over our spinner the way we want it to, or our loading background the way we want it to, which I don't think you should ever do that, but I'm just going to use that as an example. Throw a trump in there for a short-term solution until you figure out how to better solve that problem later.
Negatives also you can't select, they're by default unselectable.
Like with the negative Z-index?
Yeah, negatives are. But the way to think about it is like if you took your website, like the browser and like the screen, you turn it to the side and you saw all the layers, like what is actually being put out there. Because like what I typically do is treat them in like hundreds, where like my global header and footer are on the top layer, but then any of those like pop-ups, like something like a loading screen, and there's different levels of like loading screens and modules that will cover the screen that may be in those like front layers. It's like, do I want this? When I think of it on the side, where do I want these to actually load?
Right.
So if you're layering it together, rarely do you ever want something to be really, really high.
Yeah.
You really should only be using like 3 Z-indexes, like 0, 1, 2, and 3 at most.
Yeah, I agree with that. I use Z-indexes very sparingly. The only time I use them is like if I have a tooltip or if I need to have a fixed header or if I need to have a modal that pops up over everything. Those are the things that I need actually to show up over stuff, and I use Z-indexes very sparingly. So, right, yep. So good semantics takes you really far, and then Z-index will take you the rest of the way if you need it to. No, I think that, yeah, Z-index, that's my pet peeve as well, is when people go crazy with Z-indexes. So use them very sparingly. Yeah. Yeah. Borders, these are just different default border styles that come with it. There's a mix-in available so that rather than identifying a border every single time, you can reuse a default border, and I'll show you how to use that as well. Border radiuses, again, if you want things to be rounded, how you want them to display. Having those consistent throughout the application is really important, whether you want, if you're going to use a pill for a pill shape for your buttons or things like that. Trying to keep those consistent throughout the application is going to go a long way in terms of user experience. Same thing with drop shadows. Trying to make sure you contain and make those consistent throughout the application, and making sure that your drop shadow is relevant to what it's actually doing. So it doesn't make sense to have this humongous extra large drop shadow over a tooltip, right? You don't want to have that. You want to have it actually be relevant to what is actually showing up. You want the extra large one to be a modal that's showing up over everything. So there's a lot of context and things that you want to make sure you maintain with your drop shadows. And last but not least is our transitions. Transitions is kind of not quite mature yet in terms of the framework. These are just some basic transitions to create some effects throughout the application. We'll go over that in a sec. So now with that, we have the ability to take advantage with these mix-ins and functions to build what we want to with it. And so we will go through, actually within our application that we have, if you pull down that GitHub repo, I'll pull that open, and we'll install Clarion on that project, and then we will start building out our styles for our card component and our buttons. Any questions on any of this before I move away from it? Okay, cool. Good job, man. All right. So what I'm going to do, this is the project that should be up there right now, the Columbus Web Group Design System. And what I'm going to do is install Clarion into this application, and then we're going to start wiring it up so that we can take advantage of the styles in there. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to just navigate into the source directory here, because that's where I like to keep all of my pre-compiled code, right? Code that I'm actually working on, I want to keep in that source directory. My final code that's getting published or used somewhere else goes up in my dist folder right here, right? That's where I don't touch any of that stuff. I never want to touch it. If I mess with that, it's just going to be overridden eventually by the compiler or whatever. I stay out of that folder. Everything I do is in my source folder. So I'm going to cd into that, or change directories into my source folder. And then I'm going to do the same command I did to start out my project before. I'm just going to do Clarion new. And it's going to ask me some questions. And I'm going to go to manual configuration. And instead of starter project, because I don't need the post CSS and the Webpack or any of that stuff, because that's already being provided for me using Stencil. So I'm just going to grab my framework, right, and my style framework. So I'm just going to say styles only. And it's going to say, well, what format? And I want SCSS again. So it's going to scaffold that out for me. And now I have this SCSS folder right here in my source directory that I can now manipulate and do whatever I need to with it. So the first things first, let's start out with, let's just build a button, right? Something simple. I'm going to back out of this directory, so I'm back at my root. And so now I'm going to use Clarion to build, to create a style folder, a style file for my button. So I'm going to say Clarion, add, and then I need to tell it what directory to go into. And I want those to go into my elements directory, because buttons are a fundamental, basic HTML element, right? So I'm going to say element. Actually, it does fuzzy searching for it, so you can, if I only want to type in element or like part of the word or whatever, it'll find that directory for me. So I'm just going to say 03 because I want it to go into that directory. And I'm going to say button. Ta-da! There's my button file. And it's going to import automatically for me all of my tools that I have built already. That includes my variables, my mix-ins, and my functions. So I can take advantage of those in this style sheet. So the first thing I want to do is let's say I want button variations for each of my colors, right? I want to have a button for each of the colors in my color palette. So I have my primary, my secondary, my success, my danger, all of those. So I'm going to say, all right, let's start with our basic button. So I've created a class called button because I like to style against classes as much as possible. I avoid styling against HTML elements because that will come back and bite you. So I'm going to have a button. Within that button, let's say I want a padding of, like a padding within my button of, let's see what my values are in my abstracts file. Let's go to the spacings. I want it to be about, let's say, 8 pixels, right? I want to have a padding around that button so it looks nice and full of about 8 pixels. So I'm going to say, all right, I need a small padding. So within there, I can say include, because I have a mix-in for this, and I'm going to say I have an abbreviation called P for padding. I can say small. And that's going to grab that small padding and implement and add it to the appropriate CSS to that button for me. It's going to grab that value out of the variable section and add it to there. So now, let's see. Let's test that out, all right? So normally, how would you test something like this? Okay, yeah, so normally you'd create a button on your index.html page or an HTML page, right? You would add it there, and then you would say, okay, I add the button on there, and then I test it out in the browser, right? The challenge with that is that eventually that page gets full of a lot of random stuff, right? You get a lot of buttons, and then you start building a card component, and then you get a card component in there, and then you start building a carousel, and then you have a carousel in there, and this just becomes like a junk drawer of components, right? Well, today we're going to use Storybook to help us organize that. And not only organize it, but make it reusable so that other developers can come in and reuse our tests. Does that make sense? So what I have right here is I have in my components section, sorry, not in my SAS, but here in my components section, I have a buttons file with some button stories, all right? And in here, don't worry about this. This is just some boilerplate that I set up so that I wouldn't have to remember how to do it later. And in here, it's going to return, and it's going to ask what it wants me to return. So all I want to do is just say, I want a button in here with a class that equals button. I'm going to close that. And I'm going to say test button. Thank you. All right, and it's going to create this playground section right here for me. And you know, this naming here becomes important. I'll show you why in a sec.
Excuse me, Burton. May I ask a question?
Please.
Okay, thank you. Was this generated from Clarion, your components button?
No. You mean this
Yeah.
file right here?
Yeah.
No, this came from, I created this file beforehand so that you wouldn't have to see me type all this stuff because I'm a pretty slow typer. Yeah, this is actually up in the repo, in the GitHub repo. If you pull that down, you'll see this. But I created this file called buttons.stories. And actually, I'm glad you said that. I didn't explain this project before I started unloading it. So just out of the box, so obviously we just added the styles here. Stencil itself will scaffold out the project for you and give you a component section and a util section. And all of the templates for Stencil are written in JSX or TSX, actually. They're TypeScript files. And it uses the JSX syntax. So if you're familiar with React or any of those, it's going to be the same templating syntax for writing your HTML and your markup. The cool thing about that is that on the fly, it will automatically generate a type definition file for you. So if you're working, even if you're not working in TypeScript, what it will do is create a type definition file for your components, and then if you're using a tool like Visual Studio Code, we'll start giving you IntelliSense on those components. So you can use it. It will definitely do it for TypeScript, right? Because you can strongly type those components. But even if you're not, the JavaScript will automatically pick it up from the editor if you're using Visual Studio Code or something like that that recognizes type definition files. So you get IntelliSense and autocomplete information, things like that, for your components and component functions, which is pretty cool. So with that, it also comes with a number of other things, the editor config, a stencil configuration file, and things like that. I have added and installed Storybook in addition to this, so it's not something that comes out of the box with Stencil.js. I added it to it, and I just installed the HTML version of it because Stencil creates native web components, so it just registers and reads it as native web component, as regular HTML markup. So there's different variations of Storybook. There's a Vue.js version, there's a React, there's an Angular, et cetera, et cetera. Just do the native, just do the HTML version of it so that we can use our native components in there. The other thing that I did do also is that within Storybook, I installed a couple of add-ons that we will get to play with a little bit today. The first one is called Knobs, which allow us to real-time tweak our components to see how different input parameters or different prop values modify our code. And I also installed an accessibility tool. So you can see how we can test our accessibility for our components real time. All right. Any questions on any of those? All right, let's have some fun then. All right, so now I have my story. So what that means is in my component section, I have a buttons folder. And in there I have a button story. Don't worry about these other files yet. We'll explain those in a second. And in there, I created a button and added my class of button to it, right? So now I've created a custom method that will spin up the Storybook server, as well as watch for any changes that we do to any of our components, okay? So I'm gonna do npm run Storybook : watch. So watches for any changes. Should get things rolling for me. Cool. So now let me zoom in here. So now you see my playground. That follows the same naming convention that I had in this file here, right? Playground. And there's my button that I created with my padding on it, right? Wow, well, very fancy, right? Nothing crazy going on here. But now I can start tweaking this real time and testing it in this playground environment without having to clutter up my code in any other ways. So now I can say, okay, what else do we want to have our button do? Well, based on what we saw, it needs to be able to have a padding. It needs to be able to match the color palette, right? So we're going to, take advantage of the framework for a second here. And this is a little sass, so bear with me. It gets a little loopy here for a second. I'm going to say each. I'm going to say key. And then value. If I can spell right. In. And I'm going to grab my breakpoints. I mean, not my breakpoints. Sorry. Color palette. Actually, theme colors is what they were. And so I'm going to say for each value that I have in my theme colors variable, let's go back to variables real quick. There we are. So for each of these, I'm going to that each just creates a loop. So I can loop over each of those values, okay? So now I'm going to say, for each of those values, I want to create a class that matches that value name. So I'm going to use a little interpolation here, so forgive me for getting a little fancy, of that key. And that key is just identifying that first value. So here's the key, here's the value, right? So I'm going to loop over this, and I'm going to grab that key and create a class name from it, okay? From there, I'm going to say, I want to set the background color to that color. So I'm going to say include, because I have this handy dandy abstraction called background color, and I'm going to pass in that key, that value name. I mean that key for the background color, right? So now I've created variations of that color palette for me. So if I go back, I refresh this, I should hopefully, oh, sorry, I need to update this. If I go back in and I say button, and now I want to try using that primary color, you are correct, thank you, sir. This needs an ampersand. That's a little sass nuance there. That way it says it's got to be on the same element. Whereas if I don't have an ampersand, it means it's going to be on a child element. So it's going to be on the same element. I'm going to have button space primary. So it's going to be on the same one. I'm going to use that ampersand. So on here, I have button space primary. I go back, ta-da! Look, it's using my primary color now. Now I can go through and I can say secondary. Updated my secondary color for me, right? So now I need to be able to develop states for these as well. So I want to be able to say, okay, well, when I hover over that button, I need it to be able to change color, or at least I give some kind of signal that that color is going to be different. So now I can say, all right, use that ampersand again, so I can say hover. I'm going to change the background color to the lighter version of that. Okay, so I'm going to say at include background color. I want the key, because I want to tell it which color I want to use, which is going to be primary, secondary, whatever. And then I want the variation of that, whether it's a lighter or darker. I'm going to say lighter. So it grabs that lightest version of it, right? So now when I come back here and I hover over it, I get that lighter version. Now the reason why this is so important is because now I have a set of standards and I have a way to adhere to those standards, right? I know that here are my fixed color values that I can use within the application. How do I use those in a meaningful way throughout the app? I can easily do that by taking advantage of a small padding, or by iterating over values that are set up in there to dynamically create the values, the different styles that I need throughout my application. Okay? Yes?
Just for the folks that hate specificity, show how you would do it as a modifier.
But I love specificity. That is an aspect of CSS you should embrace, Kevin, as a web developer.
But another thing, this is just something I've been doing really recently on projects, because styling core components like a button or an anchor, something that looks like a button, there's so many variations that you typically need in an interface, like dark, light, primary, secondary, whatever. I've been actually taking advantage of something that is similar to like specificity on a CSS selector. Is adding an additional wrapper inside, which is a span, and then applying the styles, similar to like what you're doing, without that ampersand, where that class inside there is actually an increase of specificity that's applied to like a span inside of it. So when you have a span in there with that class, then it gives you the flexibility of expanding it out there.
I see.
So you're not applying it on the main element, but the child element inside.
Interesting.
I started seeing that with people doing padding, because padding's always like a pain.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, absolutely. I think, trying to make sure the DOM tree behaves the way you want it to is 9/10 of the battle. If at first you can do it with HTML, then do it. Then if you can't, go to CSS. If you can't there, then go to JavaScript. That's kind of the order of operations. If you can, yeah, just quit. Do it server side if you can. So now I have these different variations, right? So rather than having to go through and be like, okay, now I need to test that success version. I can go through it, and having to change that manually each time, what I can do now is I can wire up my knobs so that I can change them throughout the site. So here, you can see I have knobs available. That's what creating these did, right? I imported knobs, and there's these different types, whether it's a text box, a select box, a Boolean, there's other different options you can have. And now I can say, okay, let's wire these options up into this so I can begin creating my, interacting with it a little more real time in the UI rather than having to change the markup every time. So all I have to do is just say, okay, I'm gonna use a little JavaScript string interpolation here, so $, and I'm just gonna pass in that type as a class value. So now I can go in here and set to primary. Let's change it to secondary. Ta-da! Warning. So now I have the ability to begin testing different states of that button within this UI instead of having to go back and forth all the time. Very nice, huge time saver for developers. It's really convenient. The other thing that I have in here is I have the accessibility tool. Now this accessibility tool will do tests on whatever I'm building within this frame and give me feedback on whether or not it's meeting certain accessibility standards. So right now, this contrast, it'll tell me I passed 3 things. It says, ensures buttons have discernible text, which I passed. And then it will say, okay, ensures that the contrast between foreground and background meets the WCAG 2 AA contrast ratio threshold. Win. Yeah, that's what I wanted the framework to do. And it ensures every ID attribute value is unique. So make sure I don't have multiple IDs throughout the application. So it's always a good idea. You never want to have duplicate IDs throughout the site. And so as you add different elements or UI components on the page, these tests will change. This one only tested 3 things. If I were to throw, let's say, a carousel on here, there would be a lot more tests that it runs against and give me feedback on those tests. So this is really good so that I not only as I can develop faster, but also I can make sure my code is meeting our standards as I'm developing. So that's a great feature. All right, so now the other thing that we needed is that we needed, I think, some hollow and clear buttons where it's just showing the text in a certain color. And not a border or a background of that color. I think that was in our original, let me grab that, in our scope, right? Yeah, so if I look at that, we have this button down here. That one doesn't have any background or any borders on it, so I need I'm going to call it a clear button, right? And you can have a specific kind of clear button, a primary clear button, a secondary clear button, et cetera, et cetera. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another state in here, or I'm going to have a class and do an ampersand so that I can specify it with there, and I'm going to say clear. And what I'm going to do with it, if that clear class is specified on there, I'm still within my color loop here, so it's, I can still grab a color if I need to. I'm going to say background color. I want that to be transparent. And then I want to be able to have that text be a specific color. So now I can say color, and then there's a color function. It's grab that color. So I'm going to pass in that, the key for that color. And it's going to grab the color from the color palette for it. I'm also going to make sure that as I hover over it, I have a hover state for it. It just means that it's referring back to this parent wrapper. So it's going to say, it's the same thing as saying, so we have clear, a class called clear here. It's the same thing as saying dot clear colon hover. Right. Yeah, so it's just a way so that you can nest them. Yeah, SCSS does that, yeah. Yeah, regular CSS does not, unfortunately, do that, although there is a proposal to have nested elements within CSS, so we'll see where that goes, because that would be exciting. Yeah, would be for me. They got variables now, and who knows what's going on. Yeah. Unfortunately, not fully supported yet, but so it's all right. I got to support IE11 still, man. So now I can say color, and I want that color to follow the same behavior as the other one. I'm going to say color and pass in that key just like I did before. And then I want to be able to say, I want the lighter variation of that when they hover over it. So I'm just going to say lighter again for that. So now when I come back here, I need to be able to wire that up in my story. So in my story, now I can pass in, I should be able to pass in that clear. And so what that's saying is, actually, I need this to, it's going to pass back a Boolean. It's going to say whether clear has been selected or not. So if I go to my knobs, it's going to say, oh, did you select clear? And now it's going to reach, this clear value is going to be true or false. So now I need to be able to say, okay, if it's true, what happens? If it's false, what happens? So now I can say clear. I'm just going to use a little ternary expression. And I'm going to say, if it's clear, question mark, I want it to return clear. If it's false, that's what this colon means. I'm going to just have it return an empty string. I don't want it to do anything. Okay? So now, when I go back to my page, and I switch it up to primary again, and I click clear. Boop. There we go. We still have a lingering border on there. So it's a good little test here. We can say in my button section, I don't want any borders. So I could say border 0. There we go. So now I have my clear button available to me, right? I can hover over it and it'll turn light. Now let's check the accessibility. Right? Ensures the contrast between foreground and background meets the WCAG 288 contrast ratio threshold. Doesn't work very well. Let's try some of our other ones. Secondary. Ooh, it passes. All right. So now I can tell when and where I can use certain variations of components based on accessibility and things like that. I get real-time feedback on that so I can easily say, okay, in my documentation even I can say, don't use these buttons in these scenarios, only use them in these scenarios. Now, if I went through and let's say I changed font size in my button, so let's say I'd say include font size. I'm going to make this double extra large. Yes. So yeah, it's the king of buttons. So now when I go back to my accessibility test, that one passes. The text is big enough that allows it to pass. So now I can understand, okay, if I need to use this button, I can only use it at certain font sizes, right? And before, that was something that maybe a designer might have insight on, or maybe you would do a lighthouse test to see if it would return the appropriate values, to see if you pass those audits. now you don't have to wait for all of that. Now you can actually do it real time within Storybook, which is really, really good for development efficiency and design efficiency. Absolutely. Yes. Yep. Everywhere you reference that, every time you use that color value, so if you're using the functions or using that color value somewhere, it will update it everywhere for you. The only challenge with that is that if it's not the brand color anymore, people might get upset. Mm-hmm. We do. I thought you said 2 hours. They said I had another 2 hours. What? Got nothing done. All right, that's okay. I think we got a good idea of some of it. We didn't get to build any components. I'm sorry. But yeah,
So-
awesome.
With the limited time that we have left here, I don't know if there's some like highlights or how you want to relate it back to everything, and if there's any additional documentation. So I feel like now doing some of these can be probably like their own videos. Maybe even you and I can get together and follow up and do some of those.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's up to you how you want to use these last 10 minutes, and I'll stop talking.
Ooh,
But-
use wisely. Well, is there anything that anyone would like to see? Yeah. Ooh, I think that's a really good question, and I appreciate that. I think one of the first things that will be important is to make sure everyone's on the same page in terms of what the design tokens are, right? What are the color palettes we're going to be using? What are the screen sizes we're going to be designing for so that you can appropriately create your media queries and things like that throughout the application. And I think definitely just that list that I showed on one of the slides for identifying scope, going through and identifying those with both the developer and designer working together, I think is going to be really important, because then once you've identified what those different elements are and what those different reusable tokens are going to be, it's much easier for them to communicate back and forth between each other. So, I'm using the primary color here. Should I be using the secondary color? I'm using the success color here. Should I use maybe the info color, right? That way you have that language already starting to build. And then as you start building components and adding onto it, you can add that much more language and a shared language onto it. So yeah, I think that would probably be the best start, is to identify those design tokens and those key scope areas first. Wish UX designers knew. That's a brain buster. I don't know. I think I don't work actually specifically a lot with UX designers in general. I work a lot more with the development and tech side. So I know a lot of things that I wish developers knew and had familiarity with. But I don't know. I can't think of anything. I think just the idea that the web is finite, right? We have a finite amount of resources on the web. We have performance and things that we need to adhere to. And I think just the idea of understanding that teams are being judged by different criteria, right? The UX team is being judged by one thing. UI team, if they're separate, may be judged by another. Development team is being judged by a different set of standards than the UX team is. So as the UX starts, or as the design team starts building out different elements of the design, they're like, it would be lovely if we had this, unicorn riding a salmon across the screen waving to everyone. They would make them feel so magical, It's, hopefully the design team is not, they're a little more UX cognizant than that. But understanding that the web team has different constraints in terms of technological constraints as well as speed, performance, accessibility, things like that that they need to make sure they're adhering to. So just making sure that there's an understanding that there are different standards for different groups, I think is really important. Sorry, that's a really long answer for that. Yeah. Yes. I wish developers spent a little more time on thinking about things like UX and UI, and just understanding that everything they do in there cascades throughout the rest of whatever the application or for the user experience. They are affecting that. There is an understanding. They need to know that whatever they do is affecting the user experience, even if they're building APIs or even if they're building, just writing the back of the front end, the JavaScript logic that translates things, right? They need to be aware that though whatever they do has a ramification for user experience in one way or another, whether it's enabling users to interact with the site better or even enabling other developers to build more meaningful functions and services within the application. Cool. Any other thoughts? Any questions?
I think that's it, Burton. Thank you so much. And what we'll do is afterwards we'll post the playback of this. So recording of this will be posted. We'll have it up tomorrow. And if possible, can we share your slides?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, and then if there's any like important links, we can include in the YouTube description. You can help us gather those. That'd be
Sure,
awesome.
absolutely.
But
I'd love to.
overall, thank you so much for doing this.
Yeah.
Great way to
Thank you,
start the
everyone.
weekend. So
Yeah, that's awesome.
appreciate it. So round of applause for Burton.